Welcome back to Rockstock Channel. It is Thursday, May 30th, and we are gearing up for a series of conferences next month. Ahead of that, we're pleased to have today a panel of 3 guests, all of whom will be presenting or moderating at the upcoming Benchmark Minerals flagship Giga USA event, which will take place in Washington, D.C. from June 11th to June 13th. Brian Villas, who I recently met, joined Benchmark last year from Europe, focusing on political policy out of Brussels. And we have my good friend and fellow critical minerals commentator, Chris Berry of House Mountain Partners, who I'm shocked this is the first time we've ever interviewed him. But he recently joined the podcast commentariat with his Power Current podcast. So we'd encourage all of you to tune into his guests and over there. And we also have Todd Malin, head of government affairs and public relations at Talon Metals, which has nickel projects in Minnesota and Michigan and has received substantial government funding and a Tesla partnership. But both Todd and Chris are based in DC. For disclosure purposes, RK Equity has been an advisor to and holds equity interests in Talon Metals since around Tesla's Battery Day, September 2020, which was just a few months before, Trump and Biden battled it out. And as a reminder, this video is for informational purposes only, and nothing you hear should be construed as financial or investment advice. We would encourage any and all of you watching this video to attend the Giga USA event and any other Benchmark World Tour conferences and or subscribe to their various information services and price data. And remember to like and comment on this video and subscribe to Rockstock Channel and click the notification bell to ensure you can catch all our videos once they're released. You can also email Rodney and me at rockstockchannel@rkequity.com. and subscribe to the Lithium Ion Bull newsletter by registering your email at rkequity.com. So as a quick intro, Benchmark founder and CEO Simon Moores famously testified in front of the U.S. Congress more than 5 years ago, telling, congressional, like Joe Manchin and Lisa Murkowski, that the USA was a bystander as it relates to the critical mineral supply chain for EV and energy storage markets. And since that time, the Biden administration has enacted legislation and has sought to implement an enormous industrial policy that in many ways is meant to answer China's Made in China 2025 and Belt and Road initiatives. Biden has also sought strategic partnerships with natural resource-rich countries like Australia, Canada, and others in Africa and Latin America. We are now about 5 months away from the U.S. presidential election, and actually just a few months away from Tesla's robo-taxi unveil day, where we think he may unveil some new, cheaper vehicles. But Trump is leading in many polls with a platform which includes vilifying Bidenomics policies with rhetoric that is substantially anti-electric vehicle. Major U.S. auto OEMs like GM and Ford, always trying to navigate shifting political winds affecting their industry, have walked back many of their aggressive EV and battery production goals and have pivoted more toward hybrid vehicles this year. And various governments around the world are also pushing back regulatory timelines for the switch to the phase-out of ICE vehicles. China has focused on every aspect of the supply chain for 10 to 20 years. CapEx and OpEx in North America and Australia are much higher, not just because China has low labor costs, but because China has hundreds of thousands of people with the advanced technical know-how to do these things, and they have an exceptionally strong work ethic. Simon Moores, Benchmark, and others like RK Equity have talked about the battery arms race for years, that the balance of industrial power hangs in the balance as the world shifts to better, faster, cheaper EVs. We have argued that upstream raw materials will be a key bottleneck, that supply of these materials won't be able to keep up with EV and energy storage demand, and/or that China may restrict critical mineral supply and will simply replace our oil reliance on OPEC to a China reliance of these critical minerals. But here we are in 2024, 1 year from Made in China 2025. And due to China's ingenuity, these materials and cathode and battery and electric vehicles are largely in oversupply, and they're all super cheap. Supply has kept up, and even lithium benchmark is not forecasting deficits until 2029. China is exporting great EVs at $10,000 and $15,000 price point, and many countries that don't have big auto industry jobs to lose are happy to be buying these vehicles over Western brands, including Australia, India, Indonesia, etc. Can the US and the West compete with China for electric vehicles? Is the energy transition to EVs in the USA and Europe as inevitable as it appeared just a few years ago? Have we simply lost round one? And can we catch up, and what more needs to be done? How well is Bidenomics working so far as it relates to the entire EV supply chain, from batteries to cathode to upstream raw material mining and processing? Trump likes infrastructure. He likes mining. He likes manufacturing. But he's less focused on climate, energy transition, ESG, sustainability. But he's having a bromance with Elon Musk. How might all of this evolve if Trump wins? These and other questions will be the focus at the Benchmark Giga USA event in DC in 2 weeks' time, and will comprise a significant part of Rockstock Channel's ongoing analysis and commentary in the run-up to the greatest show on earth, the U.S. presidential election in November. And with that, let me quickly introduce our guests, starting with Brian Billes of Benchmark Minerals. Go ahead, Brian.
Hi, Howard. Hi, Todd, Chris. Great to be here. I'm Brian. I'm working for Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, and I'm part of Benchmark's policy and geopolitical team.
Great. And you're based in Brussels. And Chris, just a quick overview.
Sure. Based in Washington, D.C., been focused on the lithium-ion battery supply chain for about the last 14 years, which I think was when I first met you, Howard. So we do go a long way back, and work with a host of investors and companies trying to sort of demystify and de-risk opportunities along the supply chain.
And Todd?
Great. Hey, Howard. Todd Malin, Chief External Affairs Officer for Talon Metals, based in Washington, D.C., but focused as well on our operations in North Dakota, Minnesota, and Michigan to develop a domestic supply chain for nickel.
Okay, great. So, Todd, I've heard you speak many times. I think there's no one kind of more better at their job in trying to, parse through. There's a lot of jargon, in the IRA and ATVM loans and DOE and 30D and 45X. We're going to try not to get kind of bogged down in all of the detail of this. It's really kind of the big picture that I laid out there. We have an election year, China, single party state, can have an industrial policy. It doesn't shift every 4 years, what their strategy is going to be. So Chris, why don't we start with you? You're moderating 2 panels. One, I think, with Frank Fannin, but the other one, I think, was the more relevant one for this conversation, just to remind me of what that panel is and what topics you're going to cover there.
Sure. The panel is actually titled Financing the Energy Transition, and I'm the moderator, and so I will be asking questions and soliciting comments from folks from the Department of Energy, the Development Finance Corporation, the World Bank, and the ATVM program management. So basically the Department of Energy, but really focusing on the ATVM. And I think the goal of the panel is to really talk about, I think one of the original questions that I always used to get from investors and policymakers and even a lot of the companies originally was, where is all of the capital going to come from to finance this transition or to build a more domestic supply chain? And I think that, I'm sure we'll get into it over the course of this discussion, but where the capital is going to come from is no longer an issue. I think it's just a question of timing now. Again, some of the other issues, but the idea of the panel is to really outline some of the government incentives, some of the funding opportunities, highlight some of the roadblocks, maybe that's permitting, but, the roadblocks between pairing both public and private capital to battery industry projects, and then talking a little bit ideally through maybe some case studies around how government money and private money are working together to build a supply chain. So that's the first panel. I'll be moderating that one. And the second one is a fireside chat, more of a macro conversation with Frank Fannin, who many folks, I'm sure, watching or listening to this may be familiar with. Frank worked in the State Department for a long, long time and has really been a true champion for critical minerals policy here in the U.S.
Okay, great. The funding is a critical component. Again, it's Bidenomics is both an answer, to the EV, climate, supply chain, but also critical minerals. And with Giga Shah, who we interviewed, in the loan programs office, you and I, Chris, have a long experience with Lithium Americas. They're getting a $2.26 billion loan shortly with the help of GM equity. But Todd, Talon has tapped into, I think, 2 pockets of money from the U.S. government. Can you talk about those and how they differ? And I guess no one knows better the landscape than you, who have successfully tapped into this as the only nickel mine, undeveloped nickel mine in America.
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Howard. I think I kind of joke every once in a while that this whole policy landscape is sort of the alphabet soup of the EV supply chain set of incentives. And at Benchmark, I'm going to be focusing on one part of that, which is the production tax credit, or the 45X. But really what I want to talk about is, how we compete with China. What are the different aspects? There's the funding aspects, of course. There's tariff policy and trade policy that we can use. But then there's a lot of things that the industry has to do itself in terms of stepping up to compete with China and take on this very distinct government-driven policy of gaining control over global supply and then being able to use oversupply to actually affect prices. So in our case, as you said, we were fortunate enough to be selected by the Department of Energy for about $114 million worth of funding to build the processing facility in North Dakota that will process nickel from the United States and potentially from Canada as well. And then we got $20 million from the Department of Defense to do additional exploration, basically to double our exploration budget to be able to find more nickel in America. These are 2 very big programs and 2 very vital programs in this whole effort to kind of counteract Chinese government strategy in the EV supply chain.
The DoD money, that's free money. That's just for exploration. There's no matching requirement, or is there?
Well, I don't think it's such a thing as free money. Obviously, they're paying for us to do the work. There isn't that we have to, put our own money into this as well. They want us, back somebody that knows how to do exploration. But it is grant money. It's not a loan.
I mean, this is money that otherwise you'd have to raise to drill yourself.
Exactly. Think of it as a non-dilutive source of support.
I think of it as free money. I mean, but the North
Your terms, not
Dakota.
mine. I'm in Washington. I don't use terms like that.
Okay, but the DOD is giving free money, but it's in small increments, $20 million, right? The loan that's going to Lithium Americas is a commercial bank loan. They're very focused on it not being another Solyndra. There's a lot of, strings attached to it in terms of, labor that they need to hire and contingencies that they need to build in. So that's very different type of money. But the other money that you tapped into for North Dakota, is that a loan programs office, or is that a different?
No,
that's a grant.
That's from the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's about $6 billion in that particular program to support the battery supply chain. And that money is a grant. It's not a loan. But we do have to perform the task that goes toward building up a secure supply chain. We have to get permitted. We have to do a number of different milestones. So, I think it's important that the taxpayer funded dollars be judiciously and strategically utilized. But absolutely, this is an important thing for companies like Talon to be able to get this source of funding and actually contribute to the effort to build secure domestic supply chain for EV battery materials.
Okay. So the DoD, that's small money. The DOE, I guess is bigger money. And do you see any risk that these taps of money will change at all if Trump is elected?
I think that the one area of energy policy where there's a pretty consistent read across between how President Biden thinks about things and how President Trump thinks about things is in critical mineral policy and in terms of addressing the threat of a Chinese strategic government focus on clean energy technology and on critical minerals. So I wouldn't expect in critical minerals for there to be a big policy difference between a second Biden administration and a second Trump administration.
So like Jigar Shah probably won't be in his job under a Trump administration, but
Well, the people change, of course.
yeah, that's fine. But the Loan Programs Office was dormant for a long period of time. It was revived. There's some talk that he's just going to get rid of disband the Loan Programs Office entirely, or do you think he may just more selectively pick and choose them? Because there's been 4 years that Jigar Shah has been kind of open for business. Takes a long time. He's processing a lot of loans, but a Trump administration kind of look at some of these things and well, maybe he doesn't want the wind farm, or he doesn't want, the solar or the EV battery plant, but he does want, manufacturing and processing of critical minerals. So I'm just trying to read those tea leaves. If you have some connectivity to the people there, what do you
Well, I think that's what Chris is going to get into with Frank Fannin, who is a former Trump administration official, but at the conference. And I think you'll hear from other folks that are tied in with the Trump campaign at the conference. But, I think that my view is that there is this bipartisan consensus about reshoring manufacturing, about shoring up the supply chain of critical minerals that are needed in clean energy systems, but also in defense production. So again, I don't expect to see a massive shift, maybe some recalibration in priorities when it comes to critical mineral policy. I think in terms of energy policy, you could see a shift, but in critical minerals policy, I see a pretty consistent read across.
Okay. And Brian, you're based in Brussels, and Brussels is famous for bureaucracy and not speed in implementing things. But there has been some movement in the past year on critical minerals policy. If you could just at a high level update us on what's happening in Europe and how that compares to what's happening in the U.S., because there was some paranoia, Europe complained for many years that the U.S. is not doing enough, that we need to kind of follow Europe, right? And then we passed Europe and they're saying you're moving too fast, it's unfair. So give us a read on what's happening in Europe.
Yes, Howard, no, thanks for this question. I mean, I think Europe's main concern when the IRA was adopted and then implemented was that a lot of European investment would go to the US, given the very attractive tax incentives and other funding. And that was partly true, I think. I mean, a lot of European investment had been going to North America, which is good, I think, in general for ex-China supply diversification. I think in the meantime, a lot has happened in Europe. So two landmark legislations have been adopted. So you've got the European Critical Raw Materials Act, which is focused on mining, process, and recycling. Basically the same aims as the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. So supply diversification and supply localization. The big difference, I would say, between Europe's approach and the US approach is Europe's legislation or policy doesn't include stringent local content requirements as in the US IRA, looking at battery and critical mineral requirements to get the tax credit. The Critical Raw Materials Act doesn't have this. it has some production targets in view of 2030, but not legally binding. But at the same time, it does incentivize some supply localization, of course. And on the other hand, you've got Europe's Net Zero Industry Act that applies more to the downstream part of the supply chain. Same goals, supply localization and supply diversification. And it's, our industry, the battery part of that legislation is very important. Now, in terms of funding, Europe's approach, again, I would say quite different than from the US. US is very attractive, as I said before, very attractive funding mechanism, straightforward. Companies can apply fairly easily for this. Whereas in Europe doesn't have like a new created critical raw material fund or battery fund. There has been some funding announced on the European level, but not to the same extent as in the US. Europe instead uses a patchwork of funding, and that, I think, makes the de-risking challenge, because Europe's faced with a de-risking challenge, especially in mining. It's difficult to attract funding in mining projects because of price volatility, because of, I would say, Europe's fading DNA in mining. Europe used to have a big DNA in mining. Now it's fading, obviously. You've got some mining regions still in Europe, especially in Scandinavia, but that's changing. So I guess that Europe's funding mechanisms do meet some of the de-risking supply challenges, but not to the same extent as in the US. I think these are the big, I would say, differences between the US policy in terms of critical minerals and the European Union's policy.
The EU has like the European Investment Bank, which financed like a cathode and some battery plants. I think
Yes.
Northvolt, Umicore, LG Chem. We talked and represent European Metals Holdings, which has the Sinovac project, which there's the Just Transition Fund that's been labeled critical or strategic project as part of the CRMA, Critical Raw Materials Act.
Correct.
I think they're planning to identify certain projects as strategic and available. Like, so what are the funding mechanisms? The European Investment Bank, there's the Just Transition Fund, there's the EBRD. Any others?
Yeah, indeed. You've got the loans and grants provided by the EIB, the EBRD. EIB is even providing in the future, so there has been a lot of talk about this, providing funding for strategic projects in Africa, because obviously supply diversification in Africa is very important, also in the European context. And apart from that, you've got a couple of battery related funding mechanisms that have been announced recently. You've got a battery fund of 3 billion euros that has been announced last year. You've got a specific 500 million funds that has been announced at the World Economic Forum Davos. And apart from that, as I said before, you've got a patchwork of national and European funding. One of the challenges in Europe, on top of the others, but I've just outlined, is the different layers and the different levels of competence because of European funding. And at the same time, you've got member states providing state aid, like Germany. You've got the famous Northvolt plant in Germany that has received some national funding. And this national funding, this creates like a competition among EU member states, which I guess harms to a certain extent the European Union's global competitiveness compared to China and compared to the US.
Okay. I'm just thinking, you're mentioning Northvolt. Northvolt was, formed by the ex-Tesla. It was meant to be like this Airbus, for batteries, right? Like Europe does things like this. They say, it's almost the European champion. Okay. In America, we got Tesla, right? And then China has multiple Northvolts and multiple Teslas, right? And have been focusing on this for 10 to 20 years. So they're so far ahead, so from a Europe perspective, from a US perspective, just open up,
You're leaving out the
Is the
Japanese
energy
and the
transition-
Koreans, though.
Sorry?
You're leaving out the Koreans and the Japanese too, which are significant battery producers, and are backstopping a lot of the the U.S. and European, auto manufacturer.
You are very right to bring that up, and America is very happy to have Koreans and Japanese plants in America, and partner for that. So can the U.S., Japan, Korea, and Europe, collectively, like, is this a China versus all of those countries like dynamic, or is there scope for America to kind of welcome BYD and CATL in the way we've welcomed, Toyota and Hyundai and SK and LG to build plants, in America across the supply chain? Because that's where all the know-how is.
Yeah, but Howard, I mean, it's happening already. I mean, you've got Geely Automotive owns Volvo, and Volvo is making cars in South Carolina. And so, I mean, that phenomena of insourcing of automobile manufacturing in North America is a pretty well-worn path. And, I think that it already exists that those Chinese companies are in the U.S. I think it's a much steeper political wind than it has been in the past. But I think it's still possible. I think the big issue is that cars manufactured in China, I think that both the U.S. and Canada and Mexico are focused on making sure that doesn't undermine the automobile manufacturing in the region.
There's an element of this that, like, that there's a lot of negative narrative here, and you're like optimistic, right? And counteracting a lot of the negativity, and that's helpful because there's a lot of FUD noise out there, and just to remind us things like you're doing is very relevant.
Well, I mean, as a matter, of trade flows, I mean, I just don't think you're going to see a lot of Chinese vehicles come into North America. You may see a little bit of investment into the United States, where Chinese manufacturers try to invest and sort of copy the playbook of the Japanese automakers and the Korean automakers who have set up factories in North America. But in terms of inflows of vehicles, I don't see it. What I think is really interesting, though, is the alliance of, sort of U.S., Canada, Australia, Korea, Japan, and the EU to create secure supply chains is really rolling out. I mean, if you look at Panasonic just investing in Novo Monde in Quebec, Sumitomo investing in an Australian nickel miner. You see these companies that are investing from Korea or Japan that are investing in North American supply chain, investing in Europe, are actually also investing downstream in the beginning part of the supply chain. And I think that's showing that they're stepping up to the policies that have been set down by, like, the IRA and the European policies as well.
Okay, so you think, look, before Biden came to power, like under Trump, there was movement on, changing some laws, permitting and regulatory. There wasn't necessarily the money, but, like, you need a whole of government approach, and Biden really has put this, on steroids, and there is momentum here. And we just have to be careful. It's a political season, so Trump and Biden, they'll say various things, but we'll also, Trump, more than any other presidential candidate, actually did try to keep all of his promises. So you can't just dismiss what he says, and it definitely seems more aligned with Elon Musk on every policy other than EVs. So we'll see how that plays itself out. So you're not overly pessimistic that all of the countries that you just mentioned, can and will respond to the threat from China, in the electric vehicle industry in particular. I'm focused mainly on EVs because that's very prominent. It's a big industry in Germany and Europe and in the United States, and it's a threat. And there is pushback, right? There's a number of Republicans who say, like, EVs are a solution without a problem. Like, if I could buy a $25,000 Toyota Corolla and get from point A to point B, like, and I don't have to worry about range anxiety, like, why do I need an electric vehicle? Like, why do I need to transition, an energy transition, which comes with all these other, kind of complication. So what do you think, Chris, and Brian and Todd, is the energy transition, to EVs? We all watched, what's his name? Tony Seba, who said, like, whatever, 6 or 7 years ago, that within 13 years, there'll be this transformation, and everybody, anyone driving an ICE car will look like, riding a horse, in the early 1900s. So is it as inevitable, in the next kind of 5 to 10 years as it appeared, 2-3 years ago, this switch, or will it happen much more slowly?
I always sort of maintained it was going to happen much more slowly than I think the hype sort of indicated. I mean, it's a transition, right? This isn't something where you flick a switch and all of a sudden supply chains are built and we're all zipping around in our EVs. I think that, it's going to take a lot longer. And I think one of the biggest challenges right now is that, you do have some macroeconomic factors at play here. I mean, the cost of capital to build and execute these projects all along the supply chain is much higher, right? If you just look at interest rates. And so I think, one of the things that we all sort of struggle with, or maybe think through a lot in our business is, what is the proper role of government given all of these macro issues, interest rates, whatever it is, right? Job creation, things like that. And so I just think, look, quite simply in the US, the role of the US government, regardless of who's, at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, is to make it easier to build and to lower the cost of capital. And that is one of the reasons, to Todd's point, why you've seen this new playbook emerge of private sector players, whether or not it's General Motors or Panasonic, dumping, or I shouldn't say dumping, investing significant sums in upstream parts of the supply chain, because that, and I would argue the refining, is where two of the most critical aspects of the supply chain build out are. There are other interesting case studies we can look at. I think somebody mentioned Panasonic earlier. I mean, we shouldn't also forget about state level subsidies and things like that are also in play. I mean, if you look at Panasonic and the Giga factory that they're building in Kansas, it's somewhere between 30 and 40 gigawatt hours of capacity, I believe. I think maybe 32 comes to mind. But, the state of Kansas has awarded them over $800 million, I believe, in subsidies. And yes, there are strings attached there with job creation and so on and so forth. And that makes total sense. But this isn't just a situation where the U.S. government is sitting there with a bazooka ready to blast money at these projects, right? There are all sorts of criteria and guardrails that I think need to be met and respected. But the point is, the U.S. government, I think maybe initially started with Trump and of course put on steroids with Biden, has basically said, look, this is the new framework as we sort of reindustrialize and think through how, geopolitics kind of impact infrastructure investment. And what we have seen is the private sector start to come in, I think, pretty significantly. I saw a stat, I think I read it somewhere yesterday, from the Council of Economic Advisors, that clean energy investment in the United States has increased by 70% just in the last 2 years, right? And so that's a significant jump. And again, that is the private sector taking its signal, or taking the key, if you will, from what the U.S. government says they intend to do. So again, I would sort of echo Todd's optimism, I think, about where things go. But again, this isn't going to happen sort of next year. And I think that's also one of the challenges maybe we can talk a little bit about, is just the different sort of political cycles, right? I mean, I feel like maybe in the United States, there's a perpetual election cycle, whereas in China, it's sort of like they do their 5-year plans and like, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to execute, and they get it done. And they've been doing that for 15 years, right? Which is why, we've got a long way to go in terms of catching up. But I'll pause there. I just think that, there's a lot at play here, but it certainly seems like for the first time, the private sector is stepping up, thanks to what the U.S. government has sort of indicated through these different pieces of legislation.
One private sector stepping up, is like GM writing a $650 million check into Lithium Americas. That strikes me. And with the government providing low-cost funding, that's sort of like, the Chinese government somehow supporting, Tangxi, or or Ganfeng, buying SQM, right? Or, through low cost funding. And then on the other side, GM is like CATL or BYD actually investing in the mine. Panasonic, I mean, that's the biggest example of it. I think we need a lot more of that though, and also in Europe. You said, Todd, that like industry needs to do a lot. You have Rio Tinto in your capital structure, but like the biggest nickel miner, who are the biggest nickel miners in the world, and what are they doing? Like, why aren't they stepping up, to do more?
I think they're stepping up. I mean, in nickel, you're facing, a government strategy to dominate the global supply of a particular mineral and therefore control prices. And the control of the prices through oversupply means that there's an intent. There's Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, said this 2 weeks ago, that there's a clear and strategic intent by the government to work with their companies to not only get self-sufficiency for Chinese supply chain, but to go beyond that and actually be able to affect global prices and therefore undermine the economics of projects in Australia, Canada, or the United States. And so I think it's great that the government has this awareness and now we can do something about it. I think what I was talking about in terms of industry stepping up, I think industry also has to remain competitive. I mean, we're fortunate enough at Talon to have very high grade deposit here in the United States in a great jurisdiction, but we also have to do other things like plan our mine in such a way that we can reassure the public that we can protect the environment. We have to use innovation and tap into startup companies, universities, the U.S. national labs to find ways to extract more nickel from the ore or to extract byproducts or create value-added products from waste streams that would have gone into the waste pile in the past. So that's what I mean by innovation responsibility for the companies, is that we have to work with government. We have to, take advantage of some of these programs, but we have agency as well. We can step up to be competitive as well.
And Howard, one point to jump in here, back to your sort of, you were talking about Tony Seba and EVs and things like that. I think we also want to define, what a successful transition is and what it looks like. I mean, it's a successful transition, 100% EV penetration. I mean, perhaps. I mean, I think that's a small part of the whole shift, but I think of it more in terms of owning the IP, right? And so to Todd's point about extracting more nickel from the same amount of ore, or, I mean, I know we've talked over the years about direct lithium extraction or new cathode formulation, things like that. I think that owning the IP and owning that, the ability to sort of leverage that is success more than anything else. That's where jobs come from. That's where new technologies and new discoveries come from as well. So I think that when I think about, how do you define success and when will we know we've gotten there? Again, it's not an overnight thing, but I think that I really think the technological leaps that we're likely to see in this transition, if we can own those, that's going to put us in a really good spot.
Well, IP, I want to link that IP comment to Todd, what you were alluding to. You're basically saying, because you didn't mention Indonesia and the China and the HPAL, technology, but when you mentioned the Canada recognizes that, it seems like you're implying here that China is directly trying to undermine projects in other parts of the world through, their Indonesian technology. Is that what you're saying? And I don't know if we have laterite, projects here or that type of IP, but the concept of the Tangshans of the world, right, who have figured out how to, make battery grade products out of, material that you didn't think, like, and the IP in lithium for, the Chinese know how to convert lepidolite, but the Chinese weren't allowed to participate, in Thacker Pass, right? So America is not benefiting, we got to create our own IP rather than leveraging, the Chinese IP. And Anyway,
But I mean, come on, that's old technology, HVAL. It's the Chinese spent enough money to make it work. They just, a shock and awe, amount of money to pour into Indonesia and stand up that refining capability using technology that's existed for a very long time. They just spent enough money to work out the kink. But again, I think governments are waking up to the fact that this is strategic and intentional. It's not just for Chinese supply. Hopefully the policy response will be commensurate with that understanding. And I think it is.
Okay, we probably need to do a deeper dive into nickel, a separate topic. We touched on it here. So Brian, you gave us a slide here. We're going to put up the slides on Benchmark's kind of forecast on lithium, but you gave us another slide on the cathode. Could you just talk to that slide?
Yeah, just also adding some positivism here and optimism. So, as you probably know, the IRA was very beneficial to the battery supply chain in the US and spearheads the battery supply chain basically currently. And it has specifically accelerated cathodes capacity pipeline in the US. At the same time, we see still some supply deficits when you look at the supply, the Giga factory cell demand. We see some deficit because, the Giga factories in the US and the pipeline capacity there is growing much faster than the cathode pipeline capacity. So as a result, the US will be, to a great extent, still reliant on imports of cathodes, especially from South Korea. South Korea was mentioned before. South Korea was arguably one of the main beneficiaries of the IRA, with a lot of cathode supply deals between US automakers and South Korean cathode suppliers. We've seen a lot of South Korean investments going into the US. But again, these highlights, the IRA was super beneficial and has accelerated battery pipeline capacity in the US, but there are some supply gaps, especially in the midstream part. Apart from cathode, I know that's even a bigger supply bottleneck in this regard for the US.
Okay, it's very important that we have local cathode here. The Arcadium's Paul Graves said it's great to kind of, just manufacture, lithium hydroxide, process spodumene or et cetera, but, it's still going to Asia, unless you have cathode, developed here. So there is a lot of cathode development underway, I think, through Tesla, Elon Musk's partner, JB Straubel. Tesla, I don't know, kind of disbanded their cathode team. I don't have any insights into what's going on there. Todd, two questions. I don't know if you may have some sensitivity as a Tesla partner to answer them, but 4 years ago, we started this podcast in August. Elon said, it was begging, the industry to mine more nickel. And in Battery Day, he talked about battery. He wanted to be expert, in the best manufacturer in the world, right? Of batteries, EVs, et cetera. That was the main focus. In his last quarterly call, he basically said, the valuation of, if you're investing in Tesla, you have to believe it. It's a bet on autonomy. And the 4680 and the battery, he said, that's not just like a hedge, because there are enough batteries coming from the rest of the world. So I guess what's your read on, and Tesla like fired a lot of people, including cathode, et cetera. Do you have any sense of like what's happening at Tesla? And then the second question is related to your 45X panel. Again, I don't want to get bogged down into the jargon, but that's not money, direct money, but if you're actually, it's more meaningful than, a strings attached loan if you're up and running, because those tax credits hit the bottom line every year, I think forever. So anyway, if you can comment on those two things.
Yeah, we're a Tesla partner and privileged to be working with them on a number of different aspects of our ability to supply nickel. I'm also a proud owner of 2 Teslas and enjoy driving it. But I'm not going to speculate on Tesla. It's not my role. I don't work there. So, But on 45X, I do think it's real money. So I think as much as you don't want to get into the details, I do think for investors, it's worth digging into the details to understand how profound some of these programs are in terms of helping stand up projects in the United States. So when it comes to critical minerals, the production tax credit is the only part of the production tax credit that actually never sunsets. So it lasts until Congress actually closes it off. It covers 50 elements in the elemental table at certain levels of purity. But the prize that you get, and this is real money, Howard, is 10% of production cost. So people, energy, and we believe ultimately the government will include the cost of raw material. So when you think about a lithium hydroxide plant like Tesla's building in Corpus Christi, Texas, that's the perfect example of something that would be benefiting from the production tax credit for critical minerals. Think about it. On a yearly basis, the U.S. government is going to give you a tax credit for 10% of your production cost. So it's actually quite a generous benefit. The details still have to be rolled out, so we're waiting on the final details. But I actually think this is one of the things that people need to pay attention to if they're looking at investing in U.S. mining or refining projects or companies that have those kind of projects, because it's one that is actually quite significant. I don't know, Chris, do you have a view on 45X for critical minerals?
Yeah, I think it is astounding, even if you do some back of the envelope math about how economically beneficial it is to set up cathode or battery or cell manufacturing capacity in the US. I mean, if you just come back to that Panasonic plant that I mentioned before in Kansas, you think the other portion of 45X is, of course, the $45 per kilowatt hour tax credit. Or I guess that's a production tax credit, if I'm not mistaken. But my point is, again, you just run some very rough back of the envelope math. You think about gigawatt hours of production. You assume a battery size, 60, 70 kilowatt hours. And then you start, pulling out the calculator, and it's worth billions of dollars every single year for Panasonic to pump as many batteries as they can out of that plant. And that's just one gigafactory. So, if there was a way for us to sort of accelerate building this capacity and getting it up and running, I think 45X in particular really stands out as one of the subsections of the IRA in my mind, that sets it apart from the rest of the world. And Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I really think that 45X is in some ways a threat to building capacity in Europe, just again, from a pure economic standpoint. So I've always sort of been interested to see how, to your point, governments, funds and things like that in the EU respond, because I think that 45X in particular is just a very, very powerful tool for capacity here in the US.
What do you think,
Yeah,
Brian?
thanks. I've heard the same thoughts, and from a European perspective, same concerns. I think the only downside of 45X, but correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not the expert in all the funding mechanisms in the US. It's not supporting domestic miners, but only midstream and more the downstream part of the supply chain. That could potentially be the only downside. But yeah, as you said, I've heard similar reactions and thoughts in Europe about this.
And Todd, on that point, you're saying the guidance on mining has not yet been made for 45X. However, the DOE did just announce that it not just processing, but mining can be part of, I don't know if it's part of the ATVM process, but, I know that like Lithium Americas, the mining's only a small portion of that, but like the funding was definitively not for the mining portion. And the same was true for Piedmont, but now they just explain the policy. And do you think that policy will then, just translate into 45X, just adopting the similar mentality?
Yeah, the way to think about it, Howard, is that the Department of Energy can now give low cost, favorable term loan, not just to processing facilities, but also to mining operations. And this is a long-term view held by Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Manchin, and they've been pressing for this change, and the administration looked at it hard and actually came to the same conclusion that the law allows them to provide lending to mine operations, not just refineries. So that's a big change. I think it's a game changer, to be honest. And another one of these things where, you know, people, get caught up in the alphabet soup or don't want to get into the details, but the details is where you can understand how people are going to make money. So I really urge investors to maybe get into some of these details because they're quite impactful. I don't know, Chris, what do you think about the new mining ability?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought the IRA was terrific, but the lack of a focus or any kind of incentive to build upstream mining capacity was left out. I think the idea was, oh, we'll just rely on our pre-trade partners, for the raw material. Well, guess what? I mean, Australia, Canada, all of these companies, or even companies or countries, excuse me, that we would consider allies are all crafting their own critical minerals policy. And guess what? They want everything onshore as well. So you can see the tension is in the upstream portion of the supply chain, right? And that's why I think, again, incentivizing mining done responsibly, utilizing Western techniques and technologies and protocols is only going to make it easier to build that supply chain here. So that was one thing that I thought was left out of the IRA. But to your point, I mean, things continue to sort of grow and morph and get interpreted, right? I mean, we've even now are still coming to grips with what a foreign entity of concern is and how involved a Chinese entity can be in different parts of the supply chain. So, but it's again, it's headed in the right direction,
Well,
So
what's
Todd, will
happening is it's
this,
important.
if I may ask a question, Todd, will this be
Go ahead.
translated in the final guidance regarding 45X, what you've just said regarding the DOE? Interesting.
No. So the DOE loan program availability for mining is now definitively decided. So mining projects like ours are going in and talking to the loan program office and beginning the process of figuring out how to do this lending. And it, for investors, I think it's really impactful because it means that we'll have access to capital to actually build mines that get permitted.
Yes, definitely. Thanks.
Just a comment or observation. We had John Miller from TD Cowen on the podcast when the IRA was originally passed and subsequently, and he reminded us like the IRA was a big legislation, but this guidance, right? The IRS interpretations, the definitions of what is an FEOC, that's taken a lot longer to be implemented, but it's rolling out very fast right now, in part, I think, because all of the Democrat administrators who are there are saying, well, we need to kind of like get this thing defined because if we lose, and it's left loose, then it wouldn't be set in stone. So there's a lot of decisions that are coming out right now and new additions like mining. That's a big thing that mining is now available for lending. Like everyone knows who watches us, that we're big supporters of, Piedmont Lithium and and Albemarle. Albemarle got a grant of $90 million for their Kings Mountain mine from the Department of Defense. But there was always this distinction, about processing hydroxide. Actually, the mining was the problem. Concentrating lithium, spodumene, that would apply. But the actual mining wasn't previously available. Now it is available, and that's a benefit. But the bigger thing is if on the 45X, it doesn't apply to mining either in America or if you import it. So Todd, like your North Dakota processing plant, you mentioned you want to process ore from other countries potentially. Sure. That 45X tax credit today would not give you a tax credit against the imported, concentrate. But if they change that law to this, or they change it to allow for mining, it would apply, for Canada, or any other imported concentrate, as a cost, and that would significantly enhance the economics of processing that in America. I think more than anything, that's a level, a playing field leveler with China is this, reduction in cost. And it doesn't come necessarily with all of the requirements for, union labor, right, which have increased, the costs on, the Thacker Pass project, for example, right? So like you could be in any.
We don't see it that way, Howard. I mean,
No?
we actually have an agreement with the Steelworkers Union as a partnership. They're strong advocates for our project in the permitting process and other things. We have project labor agreements in place in both Minnesota and in North Dakota. We view it as strategic as our relationship with the labor unions in terms of our future workforce, showing the community that we're going to pay good wages and benefit. And we want to work with people that know how to do mining and know how to build things. So we view our relationship with unions as strategic and not as an increased cost. We're actually going through some of our plans with building trades unions that, again, know how to build things in Minnesota and North Dakota, and they're helping us find ways to cut costs. So I don't buy the premise that some of these requirements or these expectations automatically lead to higher costs.
Okay. Thank you for that. I always say that 3M, the most famous company, in Minnesota, actually stands for Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, right? So Minnesota has a long history, of building this country from the iron mines, and in the future, hopefully not too distant future, nickel mines, supplying the most important, electric vehicle maker, in the world, in Tesla. Okay, we're almost at an hour here. Are there any final comments that any of you would like to make? That this was a great, preamble or pre-brief to the Benchmark Conference. I'm looking forward to attending and hearing and making contacts. A lot of this discourse, there's a lot of cross currents of information. But final word, Brian.
Yeah, no. Basically, looking forward to the conference to continue our discussion. And like you said, we should stay optimistic regarding the energy transition, despite the tit for tat and global competition between the European Union, China, and the US.
All right, Chris, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just look for more partnerships from the private sector across borders as well. I mean, we're never probably, unfortunately, going to see a free trade agreement with the UK or with the EU. Certainly not before November, or arguably in the next few years. But if you could put something together, like for example, what the United States has with Japan right now with respect to critical metals and materials, it's not a full free trade agreement, but it's more of a standstill on I think how we interact. If you could see some things like that fall into place with some of these other allied countries, I think that would be terrific. And yeah, I think, look, infrastructure as an asset class, or green infrastructure as an asset class, is kind of the new thing. And so as an investor or a policymaker or one of these companies, you're going to have a view on how to handle geopolitics, how to foment alliances, and just think again about a lot of the macro backdrop, fiscal, monetary policy, and how they all sort of work together to come together, I think, with a salient sort of investment view. But I still see a lot of room for optimism, despite a lot of the noise with metals prices all over the place and people rethinking EV penetration rates. I still think it's very, very positive.
Yeah, I'd just add to the same comment, Howard. I thought your intro was a little dark, and I needed my black coffee this morning to get me energized. But I think the timing for the Benchmark Conference is really impeccable as always, and I think that actually there's a lot of very good news rolling out from policymakers. There is this clear recognition in the EU, US, UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, Korea, that what we're seeing is a Chinese strategy, and that Chinese companies are being aligned with that strategy through things like One Belt, One Road, et cetera. And so I think there's a lot that will happen in the next 6 months. Obviously, the election's one of those things, but we're at a really interesting time for both the clean energy supply chain and defense supply chain, which actually kind of run together. And I think we'll see a lot and hear a lot in the next coming weeks, and it's going to be exciting to actually attend the Benchmark conference.
And I'm super excited to attend that, as well as the fast markets, and get the energy of in-person contact, because just sitting here and digesting on Zoom calls and X and everything that you can get in a bit of a negative bubble. So I do get energy from those conferences. I actually do. I know I said you wanted concluding thoughts there, but there were a couple of things that I was just reminded of. We had a question here. Can U.S. funding be made available for projects in Australia and Canada, in a similar way that like the Development Finance Corp will finance things in Africa and other countries? And Brian, you mentioned the EU is talking about, European funding potentially for African projects, but you would never think like, and I asked this of Giga Shah, could you ever see loan programs funds go to fund like a Quebec project? And he said, no way would U.S. taxpayer dollars do that. What do you think, Todd? Could that be a way to bridge like America's somewhat anti-mining mentality? Say, okay, we're happy for Australia and Canada to do it. We'll give you some money to do it. We'll process it. But what do you think?
I mean, the program you're talking about is the Defense Production Act funding out of the Department of Defense. That's the same group that gave us $19 million to kind of supersize our exploration for nickel in America. What is a game changer is they have now made an investment just 2 weeks ago in Canada in 2 mining projects in Canada. And Congress last year changed the law to allow them to also do investments in the UK and in Australia. So there's over, I think, $1 billion in the DPA Title III funding envelope. And now that funding can go to projects in the mining sector in the US, Canada, the UK, or Australia. That's the sort of the provenance that you can see that investment in. But I think it's, for those projects that get funding, it's great because it's not a loan, it's a grant. And B, it really credentializes the purpose of your project. The U.S. government, the U.S. Defense Department is saying we need more of X. Whatever that project is focused on in terms of the elemental table, that's basically validating that the U.S. government is of the view that we have a security of supply problem that needs to be solved. And that's what that money's for. So I think it's actually a really strategic tool. It's so great to see DOD do the first investment in Canada. I'm sure there'll be more to come.
Okay, great. So that's a Defense Production Act, DOD money, in the single-digit billion, not in the hundreds of billions, that the Loan Programs Office is doing. So the DOE has not yet been given any power to, so this is Australia. This is part of the Mineral Security Partnership, or the Five Eyes domestic source.
Not really part of it, though. It's not really part of it.
It's not part of it. Okay.
No. It's a separate initiative run by the Department of Defense.
Okay. So there's still whole of government approach. There may be new initiatives. Who knows? Under Trump, he may just decide, this is real important and we'll invest. So bottom line is America is aware in ways that they've not been aware over the last kind of number of years. And they've been taking measures. And if Trump is elected, he'll be inheriting a lot of bodies of people, and agencies that have been focusing on critical minerals policy. And he is very focused on that. So he's not going to just rip it up. There'll be a reassessment and a realignment and additional policies. So anyway, we'll wait and see. Great. Thank you very much, all of you, for a great discussion, and looking forward to the conference. And we'll have more comments on this after that. Have a great weekend, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
See ya.